guys, today I'm going to show you my process for painting neon glowing effects with watercolors and acrylic gouache. I love this technique. I have just barely figured it out and started practicing it, but I've been really wanting to be able to paint glowing things with watercolors for a really long time now, so I'm excited to show you guys the process that I've been using to achieve that. We are gonna do some little tiny paintings right here with some glowing butterfly moth type things. And let's get to it. So first things first, I am painting probably about 4 times as big as I normally would for this type of effect. So typically I would paint a much smaller butterfly if that was what I was painting. And that would allow this technique to have a little bit more of a nuance to it. You wouldn't see as many textural issues. And that is something that I'm working on. I would love to be able to have the skill to make a smoother glow effect. But for now, I'm happy with how this looks, but just a heads up, I'm painting a bit larger so you can see what's going on. But if you size it down, it tends to create this illusion a little bit easier. And just so you know, all of the mediums that I'm using M-Gram watercolors. They're my favorite brand. They have honey in it, so they stay really soft. And I'm also using Holbien Acrylic Gouache, and this is different from Artist Gouache. It's acrylic based, so it actually dries waterproof, which has a lot of benefits, but just keep that in mind. The Artist Gouache does reactivate with layers on top of it, and it does behave very differently. So those are the two things that I'm using, acrylic gouache and watercolors. So to start off with, I like to start with the base behind what I'm painting that's going to glow. So here it's just going to be one shape, which is the background, but I have done this technique where it overlaps on top of, say, someone's hair and the background or different elements like that. So I just like to paint in the painting behind it that establishes everything. It gets it all neat and tidy, so then it's ready for when I move on to the next step for me to apply the opaque gouache on top, but everything below it has already been finished and established. So as I'm painting the background, I'm going in with a mostly very dark, shadowy paint color, but as I get closer to the moth, I'm incorporating more green, so I'm adding more of that glowing color, and it lightens as it gets closer to the moth. This is a step that sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, because the gouache has the capability of being opaque. It's not truly necessary for me to really build up the color behind it with the watercolors, but I decided as a little bit of a test today, the first little watercolor, I would have much more of that green glow color, and in the second one, there's almost none in the watercolors. So now it's on to the fun part, the part where we can create the glow effect. This is with the gouache, and a little tidbit, I love looking for little plastic lids for any of my containers up in my kitchen that I can then use down in my art studio instead of throwing them away. I love using them for the gouache specifically because I oftentimes only need a little bit, but it dries like acrylic paint, so it's hard to use a reusable palette. So this works perfectly of just getting a little bit more use out of something that would have ended up just tossed. So my preferred method is I love to build it up slowly with more and more opacity in the gouache as I do each layer. So you can add quite a bit of water to this acrylic gouache and it actually behaves very similarly, or at least it can look similar to watercolor, so it's very transparent. And this allows me to go in and start building up that establishing color of where the glow is going to be, and it helps me fade it out into the background. A word of note though, I did struggle a bit with this issue in these paintings, but it's highly recommended that you make sure that the paints that you're painting on top of for this kind of technique is the type of paint that doesn't reactivate. Some pigments reactivate really badly and they will fade when you add more water on top of it or another wash, and other pigments, they work really well. They just kind of stick to the paper and they stay. So you really just have to test out your watercolor paints to know which ones will work well. These ones reactivated a bit and kind of faded and kind of moved around, so I did not enjoy that, but that's just a word of warning and a reminder to make sure that you test out your paints so that you understand them really well. So I like to do a couple layers of this really transparent wash just to establish it. It adds the the brightness of the paint right around the butterfly the more I layer it on. But basically the technique is just I have a puddle of paint and water that starts off really transparent, and as I work on this, I incorporate a little bit more of that acrylic gouache into my mixture, and it becomes more and more opaque. And as it becomes more and more opaque, I paint closer and closer to the butterfly. Or I should say, I don't paint as far out from the butterfly. I don't spread it out as much. And that just helps so that it shows this like neon glow, so that the closer you are to that really bright glowing element, the more saturation and opacity and brightness there is. And as it fades away, it becomes more of a mixture of the glow and the background color. And if I feel like I've gone in with a little bit too much paint and it's too potent, I can always dip my brush into the water and blend it out with just pure water, and that helps really well. I love that look, so that it just helps fade it out and it builds and builds and builds. I do like to make sure that each layer is dry before I move on to the next one. And I just have a heat gun that it's actually an embosser, but it sits on my watercolor table. That thing is one of my favorite watercolor tools, by the way. It helps everything dry within seconds. So it's super fast. You can just keep working on your paintings. And I'll have the link to the one that I have down in the description. But anyways, that is basically the process. It's just building and building. Some of the layers I like to try to get as smooth a blend, and other layers I'll actually go in and give it a little bit more texture and concrete opacity to it so that it doesn't really blend out as much. I just like to give and take. It's a really fun process to play with and just explore and see how it affects the painting. I love this. It's a really fun thing to play with. I like to actually go back in and then paint the core part of what's glowing, so the moth in this painting, with a white rather than simply leaving it paper white. The reason for that is that the paper that I use is not pure white, and it also allows me to be close but not exact when I'm painting. I like everyone probably has little mistakes where I've painted over the edge into my moth, and knowing that I'm going to go in there and paint it makes it a lot less stressful. But yes, I do like to go in with just this really bright pop of white right there so that it does have that super glowy effect. But speaking more of that center element, I do like to go in with more of a saturated, really bright, opaque pigment of whatever I'm using for the glow color around the edge of the white in the interior as well, so that that bleeds into the white. And then the white is the purest white at the most center of that object. And again, that just helps it radiate a little bit more, and it has this glow. And personally, I like to finish it off by adding a few little dots of glow effect around it. I love that idea that something is just splintering off and spreading out these little glowing embers throughout the environment that I'm painting. So that's usually the last step of something like this. I'll go in and add just a bit of the glowy green and then a dot of white right in the center so that it has that pop. This is a really fun technique. I love being able to use the push and pull of having the opaque acrylic gouache to use with my watercolors. It just opens up so many more options of things that I can do to really finish it off in a way that I'm happy with. This is a technique that I am definitely still learning and practicing with. Like I mentioned at the beginning, I am excited to continue learning so that I can get a really smooth, seamless glow effect. That would be really nice. A gradient from this really saturated, bright color out into the dark background or whatever I painted behind it. So this is a work in progress technique for sure, but I think that the core elements are there for me to continue learning and to continue exploring and getting better at it. Thank you guys so much for following along with me. Hopefully this just gives you some ideas on how you can use watercolors and gouache together, or how to do a glow effect. It's really exciting and fun to think about all the different ways that they can be used together. So that is something that I've been exploring a lot lately. But again, that's it for today. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.